I've never done this here before.
3 weeks. 3 weeks of glances, conversations about Dante, and kisses that promised more. Now we're alone in this tiny elevator, the rain pounding outside, and his hands finally find my body. My heart races, but when his fingers touch my thigh, I freeze. He doesn't know. No one ever knew. I've never been touched, Vittorio, but what he told me made me go completely silent. Before, let me tell you something. If he looked at you and said your name, would you have the courage to answer? Chapter 1. Meeting at the Library.
You came here!
The silence of the Morgan Library had a weight of its own, and I knew every shade of it. That Thursday afternoon, as my fingers carefully slid across the yellowed pages of a 14th century Florentine manuscript, the only sound was the soft rustling of ancient paper and the held breath of centuries preserved within those marble walls. The rare manuscripts wing was my private sanctuary, a place where time slowed down and where I could lose myself completely in the past without worrying about the empty present waiting outside. My life had been exactly like this for the past 25 years. Predictable, safe, and absolutely solitary. I'd wake up at 6 in the morning in my tiny Brooklyn apartment, make coffee while Dante, my lazy orange cat, stretched out on the piles of books that occupied every available inch of the shelves reaching all the way to the ceiling. I'd take the subway, work among ancient pages and stories of people who had departed centuries ago, go back home, read until my eyes burned, and sleep dreaming of worlds I'd never visit, and romances I'd never live. Sophia, my only true friend for the past 10 years and fellow librarian, constantly insisted I needed to get out more, live a little, meet real people instead of just dead characters. But the naked truth was that I preferred the silent company of Petrarch and Boccaccio to the empty conversation of men who could barely disguise their boredom when I mentioned my doctorate in medieval literature. Books never disappointed me, never judged me, and never expected anything beyond my reverent attention. So when the heavy door to the manuscripts wing opened that afternoon, breaking the sacred silence with a soft but determined creak, my first instinct was irritation. Visitors to this section were rare and usually serious academics who knew how to behave around fragile treasures. I lifted my eyes from the manuscript, prepared to offer my polite professional smile, and felt all my carefully constructed concentration crumble like sand between my fingers. The man walking through the door didn't belong there, not in the way I imagined someone should belong in a silent library full of ancient dust and forgotten knowledge. He wore a suit that screamed Italian sophistication, the fabric falling perfectly over broad shoulders, and a posture that conveyed absolute power, even in the way he simply walked. His dark hair was impeccably combed back, revealing a face of strong, angular lines that could have been sculpted by Michelangelo on one of his most inspired days, but it was his eyes that held me completely. Dark as a moonless night, they swept across the room with calculated intensity, before landing on me, and staying there for a moment that lasted too long to be casual. I felt my face heat up in an absolutely embarrassing way, as I tried to look away and failed miserably. There was something in that gaze that seemed capable of reading every hidden thought, every guarded secret, every vulnerability I kept protected behind my stacks of books and my carefully organized life. The other librarians in the main room had completely stopped working, and I could feel the curious glances and muffled whispers beginning to spread like wildfire through dry straw. He had that effect on people, I realized immediately. The kind of presence that demanded attention without asking for anything. The kind of magnetism that made everyone around stop and pay attention without understanding exactly why. He approached my desk with measured, confident steps, and I forced myself to straighten my posture and adopt my most professional expression, even though my heart was beating absolutely ridiculously inside my chest. I took a deep breath and tried to remember that I was a qualified professional with a doctorate and years of experience, not a silly teenager impressed by a handsome face and a well-cut suit. "Good afternoon," he said, and his voice was exactly as I imagined it would be. Deep, controlled, and with a slight Italian accent that transformed simple words into something almost musical. "I need to consult an Italian manuscript. 15th century. Which one specifically?" I managed to respond, surprised that my voice sounded relatively steady despite the whirlwind of nervousness churning my stomach. My fingers automatically closed around the pen I was holding, looking for something solid to anchor me to reality. "Anything related to the Medici family," he replied, tilting his head slightly as he studied me with that disturbing intensity. "It's for business research." Business. The word sounded strange coming from him in that context, but I wasn't paid to question the motivations of library visitors. It was the manuscripts that mattered, not the reasons why people sought them out. I stood up from my chair and indicated that he should follow me to the Italian works section, extremely aware of every movement I made as I walked through the narrow corridors between the ancient shelves. "We have some original letters from Lorenzo de' Medici and commercial documents from the family," I explained, as I ran my fingers over the carefully labeled spines until I found what I was looking for. "There are also treatises on art and philosophy that were sponsored by the Medicis during the Renaissance. It depends on exactly what kind of information you're seeking." "I'm surprised you know so much about the subject," he commented, and there was something in his tone that wasn't exactly condescending but definitely interested. "Most people just catalog. You truly understand these works." "I did my doctorate in medieval and Renaissance literature," I replied, trying not to sound defensive, even though part of me always got that way when people underestimated my knowledge. "I specialized in Dante Alighieri and the evolution of Italian humanism. It's impossible to study that period without developing a deep understanding of the Medicis and their cultural influence." He was silent for a moment, and when I quickly glanced in his direction, I found those dark eyes fixed on me with an expression I couldn't fully decipher. There was interest there, definitely, but also something deeper that made my skin tingle with a strange, new awareness. "Dante," he murmured, as if tasting the name in his mouth. "The Divine Comedy?" "Among other works," I confirmed, carefully taking one of the manuscripts from the shelf and placing it on the nearby consultation table. "But yes, the comedy is his undisputed masterpiece. The journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise isn't just a story of spiritual redemption, but also a devastating political commentary on 13th century Florence." He approached the table and stood too close, invading my personal space in a way that should have made me step back, but instead left me completely immobile. I could feel the warmth emanating from him, the subtle scent of an expensive cologne that mixed notes of cedar and something darker I couldn't identify. My fingers trembled slightly as I carefully opened the manuscript, trying to focus on the work instead of his disturbing proximity. "You really are fascinated by this," he observed, and it wasn't a question. "I see it in your eyes when you speak. It's genuine passion, not just academic knowledge." I felt my face heat up again and kept my eyes firmly fixed on the ancient pages in front of me, afraid that if I looked at him now, he'd see exactly how much his presence was affecting me. No man had ever spoken to me that way before, with that concentrated intensity that made every word sound as if it carried hidden meanings I didn't have enough experience to decipher. "Medieval literature isn't just my profession," I admitted quietly. "It's my entire life. These manuscripts, these stories, these thinkers who tried to understand the world through words and art, they mean everything to me." "And outside these books?" he asked, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone that made something strange contract deep in my stomach. "What else means everything to you, Meta?" The fact that he knew my name, probably read from the identification badge hanging around my neck, made that strange sensation intensify. The way he pronounced my name, with that soft accent that elongated the vowels, transformed the familiar syllables into something completely new and unknown. "There isn't much more beyond books," I confessed, and the raw honesty of that admission surprised me, as much as it probably surprised him. "My life is pretty simple. Work, home, reading, and sleep. It's organized, predictable, and exactly how I chose it to be. Lonely," he said, and it wasn't a judgment, but an observant statement that hit deeper than it should have. "But also safe." I finally forced my eyes to leave the safety of the manuscript and met his. The impact of that direct gaze was like being hit by a wave I didn't see coming. There was understanding in those dark eyes, and something more that seemed dangerously close to empathy, from someone who somehow recognized the isolation I'd built around myself as protection. "Safe," I repeated, and my voice came out hoarser than I intended. "Yes, I suppose that's it." He remained there for another prolonged moment before finally stepping back, giving me space to breathe properly again. He gestured to the open manuscript between us with an elegant hand movement that somehow managed to seem simultaneously casual and completely controlled. "Tell me about this," he requested. "About the Medicis, about humanism, about everything you know. I have a feeling you can teach me things I'd never find in any ordinary history book." And then, for some reason I couldn't fully explain even to myself, I began to speak. The words flowed more easily than they'd ever flowed with anyone else, explaining the Medici family's artistic patronage, how Lorenzo the Magnificent transformed Florence into the epicenter of the Italian Renaissance, the Neoplatonic philosophy that flourished under his protection, and how all of this was intertwined with Dante's works and the evolution of humanist thought. He listened with such concentrated attention that it made me completely forget my initial nervousness. He asked intelligent questions that demonstrated a sharp mind and an ability to make connections most people would never perceive. It wasn't just polite education or feigned interest. He was genuinely fascinated, and the realization of that made something warm and unusual blossom inside my chest. Time got lost while we talked. The light coming through the tall windows changed from the golden afternoon to the deeper amber of late day, and I barely noticed the other librarians beginning to tidy their desks and prepare to leave. It was only when Sophia passed by the door and shot me a meaningful look accompanied by a curiously satisfied smile that I realized how much time had passed. "The library closes in 15 minutes, I warned reluctantly, feeling a strange pang of disappointment at having to end this conversation that had been unexpectedly stimulating in a way I hadn't experienced in years. "Then I suppose I'll have to come back tomorrow," he said, and there was something in his tone that transformed that simple statement into something that sounded almost like a promise. This research on the Medicis is quite extensive, after all. It will require multiple visits. My heart gave a completely inappropriate leap at that prospect, and I tried to keep my expression neutral and professional as I carefully closed the manuscript and returned it to its proper protection. But when I turned to face him again, I found that intense gaze fixed on me with an expression that made my breath stumble awkwardly. "May I come back tomorrow?" he asked, even though the question seemed almost rhetorical. There was something in his eyes that suggested he already knew the answer, that he'd already seen the way I'd reacted to his presence, and the possibility of seeing him again. "Of course," I managed to respond, my voice sounding strangely distant to my own ears. "I'm here every day. The collection is always available to serious researchers." He smiled then, and it was just a slight curve of his lips that somehow completely transformed his severe face into something devastatingly attractive. "Until tomorrow then, Meta." The way he said my name again, with that Italian pronunciation that lingered on the syllables, made something vibrate inside me that I had no words to describe. I nodded, unable to trust my voice not to reveal exactly how much that simple encounter had affected me in ways I wasn't prepared to analyze or admit. I watched him leave the manuscript's wing with that confident, controlled walk, and only when the heavy door closed behind him could I finally release the breath I'd been holding without realizing it. My legs felt strangely weak, and I had to lean on the table for a moment while trying to process exactly what had just happened. "Matha Bradford," said Sophia's amused voice behind me, making me practically jump in surprise. "Who was that absurdly attractive man who spent the last 3 hours looking at you like you were the most fascinating thing he's ever seen in his life?" "A client interested in Italian history," I replied automatically, trying to sound casual even though my heart was still beating irregularly. "He's researching the Medici family. Interested in you too." From the way he was looking, Sophia pointed out with a mischievous smile I knew very well after 10 years of friendship. "My God, Martha, that man practically devoured you with his eyes. And don't tell me you didn't notice. He was just being polite," I argued weakly, but I could feel the heat returning to my face and betraying the obvious lie. "Polite," Sophia repeated with an incredulous laugh. "Honey, that wasn't politeness. That was pure, concentrated interest. And unless I'm completely blind, you were interested too. I saw the way you looked at him when you thought he wasn't paying attention." I had no answer for that, because she was absolutely right, and we both knew it. So I simply started tidying my desk in silence, while Sophia continued watching me with that knowing smile that suggested she had much more to say about the subject, but was choosing to wait for the right moment. As I grabbed my bag and prepared to face the subway ride back to my empty apartment and my lonely, predictable life, I found myself thinking about dark eyes and a deep voice with an Italian accent. I found myself thinking about how a simple conversation about ancient manuscripts had made my heart race in a way I'd never experienced before. I found myself thinking about tomorrow and the implicit promise contained in that single word. Imagine if he sent you a message right now. What would you say to him? Chapter 2. Maximum tension in the elevator 3 weeks.
Who are you? Who are you?
21 days of daily visits that started as interest in medieval manuscripts and transformed into something completely different, something I didn't have adequate vocabulary to name, because all my experience came from books and not from lived reality. Vittorio D'Amico appeared punctually every afternoon at 2 o'clock, always in that impeccable suit that changed colors but never elegance, always with that intense gaze that found me across the library as if he knew exactly where I'd be before even entering. The conversations about the Medici family lasted exactly 4 days before naturally evolving into other subjects. Dante gave way to Petrarch, which gave way to conversations about Renaissance philosophy, which somehow slid into discussions about modern art, contemporary literature, and eventually into much more personal and dangerous territory. He wanted to know about my life, my dreams, my fears, and the way he asked transformed even the simplest questions into something that seemed too intimate for the library's formal environment. I discovered things about him too, small fragments he let drop between one sentence and another as if testing my reaction. Born in Naples but raised in New York, traditional Italian family with roots that dove deeply into the soil of old Italy, business he never fully specified, but that clearly demanded the kind of power and control that emanated from him naturally. There were shadows in his eyes when he spoke about certain things, a hardness that appeared and disappeared like clouds covering the sun. But with me, I noticed with a mixture of fascination and growing terror, he was different, gentle in a way that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised me. Patient with my academic ramblings, genuinely interested in my opinions on topics most people found boring, attentive in a way that made each conversation seem like the most important thing happening in his world at that moment. No man had ever looked at me that way, as if I were fascinating instead of just strange, as if my passion for ancient books was attractive instead of pathetic. Sophia watched everything with that knowing smile of hers, making provocative comments whenever Vittorio left and leaving me completely without answers because I didn't know what was happening or how to process the intensity of those daily interactions. My heart raced when I heard his footsteps approaching. My skin tingled when he stood too close. While we examined some manuscript together, my thoughts wandered to forbidden places during lonely nights in my apartment, when I should have been focused on Dante, but instead kept thinking about dark eyes and a deep voice. Today had been different from the start. The storm that had been building since morning finally broke around 5 in the afternoon, transforming New York's sky into a dark gray mass that poured rain in violent torrents against the library windows. The sound of thunder echoed between the marble walls like distant artillery, and the electric lights flickered occasionally with an instability that promised bigger problems to come. Vittorio had arrived earlier today, at 11 in the morning instead of the usual 2, and we spent the entire day talking among the manuscripts with a growing intimacy that made me aware of every breath, every movement, every moment of charged silence between one word and another. We talked about everything and nothing, about childhood and family, about choices and regrets, about the paths our lives had taken, and the places where we could have turned in completely different directions. "Don't you ever feel lonely?" he asked at one point, his eyes studying my face with that disturbing intensity that made me want to look away, and at the same time remain trapped there forever. "In this so carefully organized life you've built around yourself?" The question hit deeper than he probably intended, touching on truths I rarely admitted even to myself in the quietest hours of dawn. "Sometimes," I confessed quietly, my fingers tracing absent patterns on the edge of a Florentine manuscript we'd abandoned an hour ago. "But loneliness is safe. It doesn't hurt the same way real people can hurt." "Safe," he repeated, and there was something in his tone that suggested he understood that concept much better than most, but also empty. "There's a difference between being alone and being isolated to sorrow. You've built walls so high you can't even see what exists on the other side anymore." The Italian endearment slid from his lips with a naturalness that made my heart stumble awkwardly, and I felt heat rising up my neck despite the library's controlled temperature. No one had ever called me treasure before, in any language, and the way he said it transformed the simple word into something precious and dangerous. "And you?" I challenged, forcing my voice to sound steadier than I felt. "Your walls seem equally high, Vittorio D'Amico, maybe even higher." He smiled then, that small, devastating smile that appeared rarely, but always left me completely disheveled inside. "Maybe," he agreed softly, "but I'm starting to think I've found someone who makes me want to tear them down." The weight of those words hung between us like heavy smoke, carrying meanings I didn't have enough experience to fully interpret, but that made something tighten deep in my chest with a strange mixture of hope and fear. Before I could formulate any response, the library's speakers crackled with the warning that we'd be closing in 15 minutes due to severe weather conditions. I looked through the nearest window and saw that the rain had transformed into a complete deluge, the kind of storm that turns New York streets into shallow rivers and makes even the most resilient New Yorkers seek shelter. "You should go," I said automatically, even though part of me desperately wanted him to stay, for this day not to end yet, for this bubble of growing intimacy not to burst upon contact with the cold reality outside. "I'll walk you to the subway," he declared in a way that didn't allow discussion. "I'm not going to let you face this storm alone." We gathered our things in silence, the library emptying quickly around us, as employees and visitors rushed to escape before the storm got even worse. Sophia had left an hour earlier for a medical appointment, so it was just me and Vittorio walking through the empty corridors toward the elevators, our footsteps echoing against the marble in a synchronized rhythm that seemed too intimate for the simple act of walking side by side. The elevator arrived with a soft metallic sound, and the doors opened, revealing a small enclosed space that suddenly seemed much tighter than it should be. We entered together, and I pressed the ground floor button, extremely aware of how that tiny space forced a proximity that made my heart beat irregularly and my breathing become shallow. The doors closed and the elevator began to descend, but we'd barely passed 2 floors when a particularly violent thunderclap shook the building and the lights flickered before stabilizing in a weak, yellowish emergency lighting. The elevator stopped abruptly, suspended between floors, and the silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of rain beating against the building and thunder rolling in the sky like war drums. "Is this normal?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, even though my pulse was racing with a mixture of nervousness about the stopped elevator and hyper-awareness of his proximity. "Probably just a temporary power outage," Vittorio replied, his deep voice seeming even more intense in the confined space. "It'll come back in a few minutes." But the minutes passed and the elevator remained motionless, and the atmosphere inside that small metal cube began to change in a subtle but undeniable way. Vittorio was leaning against the opposite wall, but his eyes never left my face, studying every expression with that concentrated intensity that made me feel completely exposed and strangely protected at the same time. "You're different from all the women I've met," he finally said, breaking the silence that had become too heavy to sustain. "Different how?" I managed to ask, my voice coming out hoarser than I intended. "Pure," he replied, and the word carried layers of meaning I couldn't completely untangle. "Real, genuine. You don't want anything from me except conversation. You're not trying to impress me or get something. You just exist. You're yourself, without masks or games." Something in the way he said that, with that raw vulnerability he rarely allowed people to see, made my heart squeeze in a way that was simultaneously painful and wonderful. "I wouldn't know how to wear masks even if I wanted to," I admitted quietly. "I was never good at pretending to be something I'm not." He pushed away from the wall then, and took a step toward me, and another, until he was too close, and I could feel the warmth emanating from him, could see the small color variations in his dark eyes, could count every beat of my own racing heart. His hand rose slowly, giving me time to pull back if I wanted, but I remained completely still while his fingers gently touched my hair. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, and the fact that he was asking permission instead of just taking made something inside me melt completely. I didn't trust my voice, so I just nodded, and then his lips were on mine, and the entire world reduced to that point of contact. The kiss was gentle, questioning, as if he were learning the shape of my mouth and waiting to see if I'd reciprocate, and I did. Inexperienced and clumsy, but eager, following his rhythm and trying to imitate what he was doing even without having any idea if I was doing it right. He pulled back just enough to look into my eyes, searching for something he apparently found because he smiled in a way that made my stomach flip. "Again," he murmured, and this time the kiss was deeper, more confident, his hands framing my face while my mouth opened under his gentle pressure. My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. My hands clutched the fabric of his suit looking for something to anchor me while completely new sensations flooded every nerve ending. I'd never felt like this, never experienced this kind of physical connection that seemed electric and overwhelming and absolutely addictive. The third kiss was passionate, urgent. He gently pressed me against the elevator wall, and I was completely submissive to that positioning because I didn't know what else to do besides feel and respond, and try not to crumble completely under the weight of those new sensations. His hands slid from my face to my neck, down my shoulders, traced the line of my waist, and each touch left trails of fire on my skin, even through my blouse and cardigan. "Matha," he murmured against my lips, my name sounding like both a prayer and a curse, his voice hoarse in a way I'd never heard before, but that I instinctively recognized as desire. His hand continued descending, stopping at my hip, and squeezing gently before sliding even lower. When his fingers touched my thigh through my dress, a part of me that was enjoying all of this responded by leaning closer, wanting more of that strange and wonderful sensation. But then his hand started rising, sliding up the side of my thigh toward completely unknown territory, and panic exploded through me like shattering glass. "No! Stop!" The words came out in a muffled scream as my hands pushed against his chest, pure terror replacing all the heat and pleasure from seconds before. Vittorio pulled back immediately, his hands rising in surrender as he watched me with confusion and genuine concern. "What happened? Did I hurt you?" Tears of shame and humiliation began burning in my eyes as I shrank against the elevator wall, my arms crossing over my chest in an instinctive protective gesture. I can't." The words refused to come out, trapped in my throat, along with all the air that seemed to have disappeared from the small space. "Matha, look at me," he said gently, keeping his distance but with a firm voice. "What's happening? Talk to me." "Never," I began, but my voice broke and more tears streamed down my face. hot and bitter. Never has anyone touched me like that. I saw the confusion on his face deepen, understanding not quite arriving yet. Like what? No man. I forced the words out even though I wanted to disappear inside the elevator walls and never have to face this moment again. Never, nowhere, nothing. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any storm outside. Vittorio stood completely still, processing what I'd just confessed, and I saw shock cross his face like successive waves. The elevator remained stopped between floors, a suspended capsule where my most humiliating secret had finally been revealed, where the illusion of normalcy I'd tried to maintain during 3 weeks of conversations and smiles was shattered at our feet. I closed my eyes tightly, unable to bear looking at his expression, waiting for the inevitable rejection, for the embarrassment that would surely come, for the end of something that had barely begun, but already meant more than I was prepared to admit. Chapter 3.
This changes everything.
I opened my eyes slowly when the silence stretched too long, forcing myself to face whatever came next, even though every instinct screamed for me to shrink further against the elevator's cold wall and disappear completely. Vittorio was standing exactly where I'd pushed him, his hands still raised in a posture of peaceful surrender, but it was his face that made me freeze completely. There was no revulsion there, no judgment, not that mixture of pity and embarrassment I expected to see stamped on his features. There was shock. Yes, definitely deep shock he wasn't trying to hide. But underneath that, in the corners of his dark eyes and the tense line of his jaw, there was something that seemed strangely close to reverence mixed with a tenderness that made my heart squeeze painfully inside my chest. He took a calculated step back, increasing the distance between us even more, keeping his hands clearly visible, as if wanting to show me he was in complete control of himself. "Mafia," he said softly, his voice maintaining that calm, firm tone that somehow managed to cut through the panic threatening to suffocate me. "Breathe. Look at me, Tesoro. Just breathe." I realized then that I was breathing shallowly and irregularly, almost hyperventilating, and forced my lungs to expand properly while keeping my eyes fixed on his. He waited patiently, while my breathing gradually stabilized, not moving or saying anything except continuing to watch me with that gentle expression that seemed completely out of place, coming from a man who emanated power and danger as second nature. "There's nothing wrong with this," he declared after a moment, each word pronounced with absolute conviction. "Nothing. Did you hear me? There's absolutely nothing wrong with you." The tears came back with full force, but this time they weren't just from shame. They were from relief, from confusion, from an emotional avalanche I didn't have the capacity to process properly, because no one had ever reacted this way before. No one had ever treated my complete inexperience as something acceptable instead of strange and pathetic. My legs trembled, and I slid slowly down the wall until I was sitting on the elevator floor, my knees pulled against my chest in an attempt to make myself smaller. "I feel broken," the words came out in a hoarse whisper that echoed in the small space. "Strange. Abnormal, completely out of sync with the rest of the world." "Matha," he began, but I couldn't stop now that I'd started, the words pouring out like a broken dam. "All women my age have already experienced these things," I continued, my voice rising slightly in pitch, even as I tried to maintain control. "They already know how it works. They've already experimented. They already know their own bodies and how to respond to another person. And I know nothing. Absolutely nothing." Vittorio moved then, but instead of approaching me, he knelt on the elevator floor, maintaining a respectful distance that allowed me to have my space while still being close enough for me to see every detail of his sincere expression. His posture was open, non-threatening, his hands resting lightly on his knees as he watched me with that concentrated attention he usually reserved for our conversations about literature. "I only had books," I confessed in a low voice, looking at my own hands instead of facing him because it made it slightly easier to keep talking. "Always books. Never boys, never dates, never anything that remotely resembled dating or relationships. While other girls were learning about these things in adolescence, I was reading Dante and convincing myself I didn't need any of that. And now?" he asked gently, his deep voice carrying infinite patience that made something inside me melt slightly. "Now I'm 25 years old, and I have no idea what I'm doing," I admitted miserably. "I don't know how I'm supposed to respond or behave or anything. And when your hand went up, I panicked because I wasn't prepared. I don't know what to do. I don't understand how to navigate these situations." The silence that followed was gentler this time, less heavy with unspoken judgment, and more full of gradual understanding. I forced myself to look up, and found Vittorio watching me with an expression that mixed tenderness, protection, and something deeper I couldn't fully identify, but that made my heart beat irregularly for completely different reasons than the earlier panic. "Listen to me," he finally said, leaning slightly forward but still maintaining that careful distance. "Listen to every word I'm going to say now, because they're all absolute truth." I nodded, unable to trust my voice, and he continued with that unwavering conviction that transformed simple statements into sacred promises. "You are a treasure, Matha Bradford. Pure, special, and absolutely incredible exactly as you are. There's nothing broken in you, nothing strange, nothing abnormal. You just followed a different path from most people, made different choices, prioritized different things. That doesn't make you less valuable. In fact, it makes you more precious than you can imagine." More tears streamed down my face, but I didn't try to hide them, because for the first time in a long time, they weren't just from pain or humiliation. There was something healing in them, something that washed away years of feeling inadequate and out of place. "Other women don't matter," he continued, his voice lowering to an even more intimate tone that seemed to wrap each word in velvet. "Their experiences, their stories, their journeys are theirs. Yours is yours. And you're perfect exactly as you are, with your passion for ancient books, with your genuine innocence, with your unique way of seeing the world." "Vittorio," I managed to whisper, his name breaking in the middle as I tried to process the raw intensity of what he was saying. "And I," he said, and now there was a vulnerability in his voice that matched mine. "I want to be the man who teaches you about these things, when you're ready, if you'll let me, but on your time, Tesoro. At your pace, your choice, always your choice." The absolute sincerity in his words, the way he was offering me complete control over something he clearly desired, made something fundamental inside me shift and settle into a new pattern. He wasn't trying to pressure or convince or make me feel bad for not being ready. He was simply stating his intention and placing all decisions firmly in my hands. "Why are you being so kind to me?" I asked, genuinely confused, because this contradicted everything I thought I knew about men and expectations and how relationships were supposed to work. Most people would have just walked away, found someone more experienced, easier. He smiled then, that small, devastating smile that completely transformed his severe face. "I'm not most people, Matha, and you definitely aren't someone who's easily replaced. In fact, you're completely irreplaceable." Before I could formulate any response to that loaded statement, the elevator gave a jolt, and the normal lights came back suddenly, blinding after the yellowish emergency lighting. The mechanism started working again with a metallic hum, and we began descending again toward the ground floor, the moment gently broken by the intrusion of practical reality. Vittorio stood up gracefully and extended his hand to me, waiting patiently until I decided to accept it. I hesitated only a second before placing my hand in his, letting him pull me to my feet with controlled strength that suggested much greater power carefully kept in check. He didn't release my hand immediately, his fingers squeezing mine gently before finally pulling away. "Can I take you to dinner?" he asked, as the elevator continued its descent. A real courtship, the old-fashioned way. Flowers, nice restaurant, conversations without pressure. "I want to do this right, Maida. I want to court you properly." The old-fashioned formality of the word courtship made a shy smile appear on my face, despite the tears still wet on my cheeks. "I would love that very much," I replied, my voice still a bit hoarse but much firmer than it had been minutes ago. The elevator doors opened, revealing the library's empty lobby, the storm still raging outside the large glass doors. Vittorio gestured for me to exit first, and then walked beside me toward the exit, maintaining a respectful but clearly protective distance as he observed the deluge outside with a thoughtful expression. "Where do you live?" he asked, and when I hesitated out of pure force of habit, of never revealing personal information to people I barely knew, he added gently, "I'm going to take you home, Tesoro. I'm not going to let you take the subway alone in this storm." "Brooklyn," I finally replied, "not far from Clark Street Station." He took his phone from his pocket and typed something quickly before putting it away again. "My driver is coming. 5 minutes maximum." "You have a driver?" I asked, before I could stop myself, and then blushed, because obviously he had a driver considering the level of elegance and power that emanated from him naturally. "I do," he confirmed with a touch of humor in his voice. "Among other things I'll probably have to explain to you eventually, but not today. Today has already had enough emotional revelations for both of us." We stood in comfortable silence waiting for the car, and then an elegant black sedan stopped in front of the library, and Vittorio produced a large umbrella from somewhere, opening it and holding it over both of us as we ran through the rain toward the vehicle. He opened the back door for me and waited until I was comfortably settled before entering from the other side, closing the wet umbrella with an efficient movement. The car's interior was luxurious in a quiet way. Soft leather and polished wood, completely different from any vehicle I'd ever been in. The driver said nothing, simply waited for instructions, while Vittorio looked at me expectantly. "Address?" he asked gently. I provided my address in a low voice, and the driver nodded, beginning to drive through Manhattan's flooded streets with professional skill. The rain beat against the windows in a constant, hypnotic rhythm, creating a bubble of privacy inside the car where the outside world seemed distant and less real. "Thank you for understanding," I said after a few minutes, looking at my hands clasped in my lap instead of facing him directly. "For not making me feel worse than I already felt. Thank you for trusting me," he replied. And when I finally gathered the courage to look in his direction, I found those dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my heart race again. "I know it wasn't easy to reveal something so personal. I know you were probably expecting a completely different reaction, but Maida, you need to understand something." "What?" I asked in a low voice. "This doesn't change how I feel about you. If anything, it makes everything more precious, more important, more something worth protecting and preserving." He paused, seeming to carefully choose his next words. "I've spent my entire adult life surrounded by people who want things from me. Power, money, connections, protection. Everyone wants something, but you just want to talk about Dante and medieval manuscripts. You're genuine in a way I'd forgotten existed in the world." I didn't know what to say in response to that raw confession, so I simply let the silence speak for me as the car navigated through Brooklyn toward my small, humble apartment that suddenly seemed worlds away from the sophisticated universe Vittorio clearly inhabited. When we finally stopped in front of my modest building, the rain had diminished to a persistent drizzle. Vittorio got out first and walked around the car to open my door, keeping the umbrella over me as he accompanied me to the building entrance. We stood there under the small awning, water dripping around us, and suddenly I felt ridiculously reluctant to go inside and end this strange, intense, and transformative day. "Dinner tomorrow?" he asked, his eyes seeking mine in the small space between us. "Tomorrow," I agreed, with a smile that felt more genuine than any I'd given in recent weeks. He leaned in and kissed my forehead gently, a gesture so tender and protective that it made tears prick at my eyes again. "Sleep well, tesoro. I'll see you tomorrow." I watched the car drive away, before finally entering the building and climbing the stairs to my third-floor apartment. Dante greeted me with his usual demanding meow, complaining about the late dinner hour, but I barely registered his protests as I let myself fall onto the couch and finally allowed everything that had happened to hit me all at once. My phone vibrated with a message from Sophia. "Are you okay? The library closed early because of the storm. Call me when you get home." I called her and had barely said hello before the interrogation began. "Where were you?" "I've been trying to call you for an hour." "I got stuck in the elevator," I replied. And then, because it was Sophia, and because I desperately needed to process everything with someone, I added, "with Vittorio." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds before she exploded. "You what?" "Start talking right now, Maitha Bradford. Everything. Every detail." And so I told her. Not everything, because some things were too private even for my best friend, but enough for her to understand that something fundamental had changed during those hours stuck between floors. I told her about the kiss, about my panic, about my disastrous confession, and most importantly, about his reaction, which had been everything except what I expected. "Matta," Sophia said, when I finally stopped talking, her voice uncharacteristically serious. "You sound different. Even through the phone I can feel it. You sound radiant, awake somehow." And I realized she was right. Despite all the terror and shame and raw vulnerability, there was something inside me that seemed to shine in a completely new way. For the first time in 25 years, I wasn't just existing between ancient pages and other people's stories. I was living my own story, and while it was deeply frightening, it was also absolutely thrilling. Chapter 4.
This is your world?
The weeks that followed that afternoon in the elevator were like living inside a romance I would have considered too fantastical to be real if I were just reading about it. Vittorio kept his promise of proper courtship in a way that completely exceeded any expectations I could have formed during my 25 years of total inexperience. Flowers arrived at my apartment regularly, not extravagant and flashy arrangements, but carefully chosen bouquets of white lilies and peach roses that he somehow knew were my favorite flowers, without me ever having explicitly mentioned it. The dinners were at elegant restaurants, where maitre d's greeted him by name and led us to private tables where we could talk without interruption. He took me to the Met on a rainy Sunday, and we spent hours wandering through the Renaissance galleries while I rambled passionately about perspective and and symbolism, and he listened with that concentrated attention that transformed even my most academic observations into something that seemed important and valued. We walked through Central Park on autumn afternoons, when the leaves were beginning to change color, talking about everything and nothing while our emotional intimacy grew steadily and naturally. But what surprised me most was his absolute patience with the physical aspect of our relationship. After that confession in the elevator, I expected discomfort, or subtle pressure, or that poorly disguised impatience I imagined men felt when they got involved with women who didn't know what they were doing. Instead, Vittorio never pressured, never suggested more than I was clearly comfortable giving, never made me feel inadequate for my slow and hesitant pace. Our kisses evolved gradually over the weeks, each one a bit deeper and more confident than the previous one. At first, they were just gentle, brief touches of lips, chaste goodbyes at my apartment door that left my heart racing, but without that panic that had consumed me in the elevator. Then they became longer, his hands framing my face as he explored my mouth with patience that seemed infinite, teaching me through example how to respond and participate instead of just passively accepting. One night, after a particularly wonderful dinner, where we laughed so much my stomach hurt, he kissed me leaning against my apartment door, and for the first time I felt confident enough to be a bit bolder. My hands, which usually clung to the fabric of his shirt insecurely, slid up to his neck and then to his hair, fingers intertwining in those dark strands that always seemed perfectly groomed. He made a low sound in his throat, something between surprise and approval, and the kiss deepened in a way that made my entire body vibrate with sensations I was beginning to recognize as desire. When we finally separated, we were both breathing irregularly, and his dark eyes had an intensity that made my pulse accelerate, for reasons that were no longer just nervousness. "You're getting more comfortable," he observed, his voice hoarse in a way that made me feel powerful and desired at the same time. "More confident. You're a good teacher," I replied shyly, and the smile that lit up his face was worth every moment of embarrassment I'd experienced during those first awkward weeks. It was that same night, after he left and I was lying in bed unable to sleep with Dante snoring at my feet, that I realized my curiosity was beginning to outweigh my fear. Conversations with Sophia during our coffee breaks at the library increasingly revolved around questions I'd never allowed myself to ask before. Questions about what it was like to be with someone completely, about what to expect and how to navigate those experiences that had always seemed so distant and unreachable. "How do you know when you're ready?" I asked her on a particularly quiet afternoon, while we catalogued a new acquisition of Florentine manuscripts. Sophia looked at me with that wisely amused expression she reserved for moments like these. "You just know, honey, when fear becomes smaller than desire, when trusting him is more important than protecting yourself. It's different for each person." But the truth was, I already trusted him more than I'd ever trusted anyone. Vittorio had become an essential part of my daily routine, the person I wanted to share every thought and experience with, the face I looked for in crowds, and the name that appeared first in my notifications. He knew my fears about inadequacy and strangeness, knew my tendency to lose myself in books when reality got too intense, knew even about my absent father and my mother, who died when I was 15. Leaving me essentially alone in the world. And I was beginning to know him too, although I felt there were layers in him that remained carefully hidden. He spoke about his nonna in Italy with genuine tenderness, about growing up between two worlds and never feeling completely part of either, about the responsibility of carrying the family name and everything that came with it. But there were things he didn't talk about, strategic silences when certain subjects came up, a way of changing topics smoothly when I asked questions about exactly what kind of business he ran. I began to notice small details that didn't fit with the image of successful businessman he presented. The car he used changed regularly, always elegant black sedans, but never the same one twice in a row. Sometimes when we were walking, I noticed men keeping respectful but constant distance, clearly following our movements too professionally to be coincidence. His phone calls often happened in rapid, tense Italian, and although my command of the language was limited to academic, I could catch tones of command and authority that suggested much more power than he casually admitted. One night he had to cancel our dinner at the last minute due to an urgent business emergency, and his voice on the phone carried a hardness I'd never heard before, a coldness that reminded me there were sides of him I still didn't know completely. When we met the next day, there was a tension in his shoulders that took hours to dissipate, and I noticed light scrapes on his knuckles that he dismissed as the result of an accident at the gym. But even with these subtle signs that there was more to Vittorio D'Amico than he revealed, my trust in him remained unwavering. Because regardless of what he did in his mysterious business, or who he was outside the time we spent together, with me, he was invariably kind, patient, and deeply caring in ways that made my heart expand until it seemed too big to fit inside my chest. It was during a particularly beautiful walk through the High Line on a golden October afternoon that I finally voiced what had been growing inside me for weeks. We were standing looking at the Hudson River, his hand wrapped around mine protectively, and the words simply came out before I could fully consider them. "I want to learn," I said quietly, keeping my eyes fixed on the shimmering water because it was easier than facing him directly. "About what it's like to be with someone completely, about all the things I don't know." I felt his entire body tense beside me, his hand squeezing mine hard before consciously relaxing. With you," I continued quickly, my courage fleeing rapidly but determined to finish what I'd started. "I want that experience with you, only with you." He was silent for a moment that seemed to stretch eternally before gently turning my body to face him, his hands holding my shoulders while those dark eyes studied me with an intensity that made my breathing stumble. "When you're completely ready," he said firmly, each word loaded with visible restraint. "Not before. This isn't something we rush to sorrow." "How will I know?" I asked, echoing the question I'd asked Sophia days before. "You'll know," he replied with absolute conviction. "Trust your heart. When the moment is right, there will be no doubt." He kissed me then, there in the middle of the High Line, with people passing around us and the city stretching in all directions. And in that kiss, there was promise and patience and a contained desire that matched my own in ways I was only beginning to fully understand. Chapter 5.
She knows something.
His apartment was exactly as I imagined it would be, and at the same time completely surprising in its understated elegance. The penthouse occupied the top floor of a Manhattan building, with panoramic views that transformed the city into a carpet of twinkling lights, stretching as far as my eyes could reach. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed that spectacular view, and the interior was decorated with refined taste that balanced modernity with classic touches that recalled his Italian heritage. It was the first time Vittorio had invited me to his private space, after weeks of dinners at restaurants and walks through public places, and the implicit intimacy of that invitation made my heart beat irregularly as he guided me through the spacious living room to the balcony overlooking the illuminated skyline. The November night air was cool, but not uncomfortable, and he'd placed outdoor heaters that created bubbles of inviting warmth in the open space. "It's beautiful," I murmured, genuinely impressed by the view that seemed like something out of a romantic movie instead of the real life of someone I knew. "It doesn't compare to the company," he replied softly, and the sincerity in his voice made heat rise up my neck despite the cool breeze. We dined there on the balcony, a small table lit by candles he'd prepared personally, insisting on cooking instead of ordering food or hiring catering service. The meal was surprisingly simple considering the sophistication of the setting. Homemade pasta with sauce, he explained, was his nonna's recipe, and the gesture of sharing something so personal and traditional made the dinner feel much more meaningful than any five-star restaurant could have been. We talked about everything while we ate, our ease with each other having grown to the point where silences were as comfortable as words. He made me laugh, telling stories about growing up in a large, loud Italian family, about his nonna who insisted on feeding everyone until they exploded, and about cousins who still lived in Tuscany running vineyards that had belonged to the family for generations. "Have you visited them recently?" I asked, taking a sip of the red wine he'd carefully chosen to accompany the meal. Something passed quickly across his face, a shadow that came and went so fast I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Not in a few years. Business keeps me busy here, but I'll take you one day if you want. To meet Nonna, see where my family came from." The casualness with which he included distant future in our plans made my heart leap, the implication that this between us was something lasting and real instead of temporary or superficial. "I would love that," I replied honestly, imagining grape fields under Italian sun, and an elderly lady with rosy cheeks welcoming me into her kitchen. After dinner, we moved inside when the air got too cold even for the heaters, and Vittorio put on soft music that floated through the apartment, creating an atmosphere that seemed suspended in time. We sat on the large leather couch, closer than we'd been in public settings, and awareness of that proximity made something hum quietly inside my chest. "Can I ask you something?" he said after a moment, his hand finding mine and intertwining our fingers in a way that had already become familiar and comforting. "Always," I replied, turning my body slightly to face him better. "Are you happy with this, with what we're building together?" There was genuine vulnerability in his question, as if my answer mattered more than he wanted to admit. "Happier than I ever thought I could be," I confessed with raw honesty. "You brought color to a life that was all black and white. Vittorio, you made me want things I never thought I needed or deserved." He lifted our intertwined hands and kissed my fingers gently, a gesture so tender it made tears unexpectedly prick at my eyes. And then, moved by impulse that came from some deep place inside me where courage and desire lived together, I leaned forward and kissed him. It was the first time I'd initiated real physical contact between us, and I felt his momentary surprise before he responded, his hands moving to frame my face as the kiss deepened in ways that made my head spin slightly. There was no hesitation this time, none of that paralyzing panic that had consumed me in the elevator weeks ago. There was only growing curiosity and desire to be closer, to know more, to experience everything that had been denied for 25 years of self-imposed isolation. Maita, he murmured against my lips, my name sounding like both prayer and warning. Don't stop, I whispered back, my hands moving to explore territories that before had seemed too forbidden to consider. The solidity of him under my palms, the warmth emanating through the thin fabric of his shirt, the way his heart beat as rapidly as my own. Everything was fascinating and new and absolutely addictive. Time got lost as we kissed on that couch, the illuminated city stretching outside the windows like a silent witness, while something inside me gradually awakened to awareness that had slept through my entire adult life. There was no rush in our movements, only patient exploration and mutual discovery that left my skin tingling and my breathing irregular. I never knew, I murmured at one point, when he pulled back just enough to look into my eyes, searching for confirmation that I was okay, that this was what I wanted. Never knew it could be like this.
I have to stop this.
Like what? He asked, his voice hoarse in a way I now recognized as contained desire. So intense, so consuming, so absolutely right. He smiled then, that smile that transformed his entire face and made my heart melt completely. This is just the beginning, Tesoro. There's so much more. The shrill ring of his phone cut through the moment like a sharp knife, destroying the intimate bubble we'd created around ourselves. Vittorio closed his eyes briefly, frustration clear in every line of his body before grabbing the device and checking who was calling. His expression changed instantly when he saw the name on the screen, all softness being replaced by hardness he rarely showed with me. I have to take this, he said, his voice having assumed a tone of command he'd never used in my presence. It's urgent. I nodded with understanding, even though frustration matched his, watching as he stood and walked toward the home office, speaking rapidly in Italian as soon as he answered the call. I managed to catch occasional words, my academic education providing fragments of comprehension, but the context remained obscure, except for the tone that suggested serious problems requiring immediate attention. When he returned 15 minutes later, the tension in his shoulders was unmistakable. I need to handle something, he explained reluctantly. Something that can't wait until tomorrow. It's okay, I assured, even though my heart sank with disappointment. I understand. He took me home in heavy silence, his hand holding mine the entire journey, as if he needed that physical connection to anchor himself. At my apartment door, he pulled me into a tight embrace that seemed almost desperate in its intensity. We'll continue this later? I asked against his chest, feeling the accelerated beating of his heart. Promise me, he replied, his hands moving to frame my face and force me to look into his eyes. Promise we'll continue this when the time is right. I promise, I whispered, and the kiss that sealed that promise carried urgency and frustration and anticipation of something we both knew was inevitably coming. Chapter 6.
Tell me the truth.
The library was exceptionally quiet that Friday morning, only the occasional sound of pages turning and the distant hum of the climate control system breaking the reverent stillness that always hung over the rare manuscripts wing. I should have been focused on the cataloging work piling up on my desk, a new acquisition of 16th century Florentine letters that normally would have left me absolutely fascinated. Instead, my thoughts kept wandering to the previous night, to those moments in Vittorio's apartment before the urgent call interrupted everything. Sophia appeared in my office doorway with 2 cups of coffee, and that determined look that meant she wouldn't be dissuaded from a serious conversation, regardless of how much work I claimed to have. "Mandatory break," she announced, placing one of the cups on my desk and settling into the chair beside me with the familiarity of 10 years of friendship. "You've had that look since you got here this morning, so you can start talking now." I sighed and carefully pushed the manuscript aside, accepting defeat because Sophia knew all my signs of emotional agitation better than I did myself. "I think I'm ready," I said quietly, the words coming out before I could reconsider them or wrap them in elaborate explanations. "Ready for what?" she asked, though the knowing gleam in her eyes suggested she already knew exactly what I meant. To be with him, completely. I felt heat rising up my neck as I spoke, but forced myself to maintain eye contact, because this was too important to let embarrassment silence me. To stop being afraid and just live the experience he's been so patient waiting for me to be ready to have. Sophia was silent for a moment, studying my face with that concentrated attention she reserved for serious matters. "Meta," she began carefully, choosing her words with obvious care. "He seems intense. Dangerous, maybe. There are things about Vittorio D'Amico you clearly don't know, things he's not telling you." "I know," I admitted, because I wasn't blind to the subtle signs that had accumulated over the weeks. The phone calls, intense Italian, the constantly changing cars, the men who kept respectful but vigilant distance whenever we went out together. I know there are parts of his life he keeps separate from me, things that probably involve the kind of business normal people don't do. "And that doesn't scare you?" Sophia asked, genuinely concerned in a way that made my heart squeeze with affection for my protective friend. "He scares me," I confessed honestly. "His intensity, the power that emanates from him as second nature, the shadows I occasionally see in his eyes when he thinks I'm not paying attention, all of that scares me. But it also fascinates me, and more importantly, I trust him completely." "Trust based on what?" she challenged gently. "Weeks of romantic dinners and conversations about old books? Trust based on how he treats me," I replied with conviction that surprised even myself. "On the patience he demonstrates every day, on the way he respects every boundary I set, on the way he looks at me like I'm precious instead of just convenient. Vittorio could have any woman in New York, Sophia. Experienced, sophisticated women who know exactly what they're doing. But he chose to wait for me, for the awkward, inexperienced version who has no idea how to navigate situations other people master naturally." "You love him," Sophia said, and it wasn't a question, but a soft statement that hit directly at the center of everything I'd been avoiding admitting even to myself. Tears pricked at my eyes because she was absolutely right, and because saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking about it never could. "Yes," I whispered, the word carrying the weight of a truth that changed everything. "I love him, completely, irrevocably, in ways I didn't know it was possible to love another person." Sophia reached over and held my hand, squeezing gently. "Then you already know what you need to do." And I did. The decision had solidified at some point during the sleepless night I'd spent replaying every moment with Vittorio, every conversation, and every kiss, and every tacit promise of a future together. I didn't want to wait anymore for the perfect moment to arrive, or for all my insecurities to magically disappear. I wanted to live, instead of just watching life happen through the pages of books, written by people who'd been brave enough to experience things I'd always avoided. The rest of the workday passed in a fog of nervous anticipation, my heart beating irregularly every time I thought about what I was about to do. When 6 o'clock finally came and the library began to close, I grabbed my coat and bag with slightly trembling hands and forced myself to move forward before courage could abandon me completely. Vittorio's building was as imposing as I remembered, the doorman recognizing me from previous times and letting me pass with a polite nod after I explained I wanted to surprise him. The elevator rose silently to the penthouse, each floor that passed making my pulse accelerate, until I thought my heart might explode completely out of my chest. When the doors opened directly into his apartment, I found Vittorio standing near the windows looking at the city view, still wearing suit pants, but with his shirt unbuttoned at the first few buttons and sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He turned when he heard the elevator, genuine surprise crossing his face when he saw me standing there in the entrance as if frozen in place. "Matey," he said, quickly crossing the space to where I stood. "Is everything okay? Did something happen? Remember last night?" I began, my voice coming out steadier than expected, considering how my stomach was churning with nervousness. What almost happened before the call interrupted? I saw gradual understanding appear in his eyes, followed by something darker and more intense that made my skin tingle with awareness. "How could I forget?" he replied, his voice taking on that hoarse quality I now recognized as contained desire. I took a deep breath, gathering all the courage I possessed. "I want to finish what we started, in the elevator that stormy afternoon, last night in this apartment. In every moment between those 2 points, I want all of that and more." Vittorio went completely still, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that should have been intimidating, but instead made me feel seen and valued in ways I'd never experienced before. "Maida, you need to be absolutely sure," he said carefully, each word measured and deliberate. "This isn't something we do on impulse or because you think it's what I want to hear. I want you to be my first," I declared with conviction that came from some deep place inside me where fear and desire had finally found balance. "My only. The person who teaches me about all the things I spent 25 years avoiding because I was too scared to truly live." He took a step closer, his hands rising to frame my face with that gentleness that always completely undid me. "Are you absolutely certain?" he asked again, searching my eyes for any sign of hesitation or doubt. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I replied honestly, my own hands covering his where they rested against my face. This scares me. You scare me sometimes with the intensity of what I feel, but I want this more than I want safety or control or any of the things I used as an excuse to keep myself isolated for so long. Something shifted in his expression, softness mixing with determination, and that contained desire he kept so carefully under control. This changes everything, Tesoro, he warned, his voice low and intense. No going back after we cross this line. You understand that? I don't want to go back, I assured him, my hands squeezing his with strength that surprised even myself. I want to move forward, with you, only with you. Then we go slowly, he promised, leaning in to kiss my forehead with tenderness that made tears prick at my eyes. We go gently, we go together, every step of the way. And in that moment, standing in his apartment with the illuminated city stretching through the windows like a silent witness, I felt the last wall of fear crumble completely. What would come next was unknown and frightening and absolutely inevitable. But for the first time in my entire adult life, I was ready to experience instead of just observe. Chapter 7.
I'll protect them.
Vittorio's bedroom was different from the rest of the apartment, less formal and more personal in ways that surprised me. There were framed photographs on an antique dresser that clearly had history, books stacked on the nightstand revealing literary tastes we'd never fully discussed, and a sense that this space was where the man behind all that elegance and power finally allowed the masks to fall. He'd lit candles while I waited in the living room, the soft light dancing on the walls and creating an atmosphere that seemed suspended between real and dreamed. Rose petals were scattered with obvious care, a gesture that might have seemed overly romantic, coming from anyone else, but from him simply demonstrated how much this night meant. Music played softly from somewhere I couldn't identify, something classical and Italian I vaguely recognized as Puccini. You prepared all this while I waited, I asked, my voice coming out more tremulous than I intended, as I observed the careful details that transformed the bedroom into something special. I wanted it to be perfect for you, he replied, standing close but not pressuring me, letting me set the pace as he always did. I wanted every moment of this night to be something you'd keep as a precious memory instead of just a rushed experience. Tears pricked at my eyes at the evident care in every detail, the way he'd thought about what I might want and need, even though I didn't fully know myself. Vittorio, I whispered, unable to form more articulate thoughts, as emotion tightened my throat. He approached then and framed my face with his hands, that gesture that had become so familiar and comforting over the weeks. Tell me if anything makes you uncomfortable, he asked softly, his dark eyes seeking mine with intensity that went far beyond the physical. We stop anytime you tell me to stop. This is for you, Tesoro. Everything is for you, and about you, and on your time always. I trust you with everything I have, I replied, with absolute conviction that came from some deep place inside me, where fear had finally given way to certainty. I trust you with parts of me I never knew existed, until you showed up at the library, asking to see manuscripts about the Medicis. He smiled then, that soft, devastating smile that completely transformed his severe face. Best pretext I ever invented, he murmured, leaning in to kiss my forehead with tenderness that made my heart melt completely. The kiss that followed was different from all the others we'd shared before. There was promise in it, an infinite patience, and a reverence that made me feel precious in ways words could never adequately express. His hands moved with deliberate gentleness, each gesture a silent question I answered by leaning closer, trusting he would guide me through unknown territory, with the same care he demonstrated in everything related to me. So beautiful, he murmured against my hair at one point, his voice loaded with emotion that went far beyond simple physical attraction. So perfect and brave and absolutely incredible. Time got lost as the night progressed at its own natural pace, each moment building on the previous one, in ways that made my heart race and my breathing become irregular. There was nervousness, definitely, that acute awareness that I was crossing a threshold that couldn't be undone. But there was also an overwhelming sense of rightness, that this was exactly where I should be, and with exactly the right person. When the moment we'd been building toward for weeks of patient courtship finally came, Vittorio stopped and held my face between his hands, forcing me to look directly into his dark eyes that shone with raw emotion in the flickering candlelight. Last chance to change your mind, he said seriously, though I could see the effort it cost to offer that exit when he clearly wanted to continue as much as I did. I'm not changing my mind, I assured him, my own hands covering his. I want this. I want you. I want everything that comes with choosing to live instead of just exist. Sei mia ora, he murmured in Italian, the words escaping in a moment of intense emotion. You're mine now, completely, and I am completely yours. What followed was too intimate for adequate words, an experience that transcended any description books or conversations could have prepared me for. There were moments of initial discomfort that Vittorio navigated with infinite gentleness, his voice whispering comforting words in a mixture of English and Italian, while he patiently waited for me to adjust to each new sensation. But above all, there was a deep connection that went far beyond the merely physical, a union of souls that made every second precious in ways I never could have anticipated. When everything finally calmed, and we lay together in the soft twilight of the bedroom, I felt fundamentally transformed in ways I was still processing. Vittorio held me protectively, his fingers tracing absent patterns in my hair, as my heart gradually returned to normal rhythm. "How are you, amore?" he asked softly after a comfortable silence, gently turning my face so he could study my features in the flickering light. "Different," I admitted honestly, searching for adequate words for sensations I had no vocabulary to describe. "Complete in a way I never knew I was incomplete. Yours in ways that go far beyond what we just shared." "You're mine," he agreed, his voice carrying a possessiveness that should have scared me, but instead made me feel protected and valued. "And I'm completely yours. Forever, tesoro. This isn't temporary or casual. It's permanent and absolute." The tears came back then, but they were from pure happiness instead of fear or regret. "I love you," I said, for the first time out loud, the words coming out in a whisper that still carried the weight of absolute truth. "I love you in ways I didn't know were possible." "Ti amo," he replied in Italian before repeating in English. "I love you, Maida. I love everything about you, from your passion for ancient manuscripts to the way you blush when you're nervous. I love your courage and your vulnerability, and your capacity to trust even when you're scared." We fell asleep intertwined, while the city continued alive outside the windows, emotionally and physically exhausted, but completely at peace in ways neither of us had experienced before. And for the first time in 25 years, I didn't dream about book characters or lives other people had lived. I dreamed about a real future being built moment by moment with the man who had completely transformed my carefully controlled existence. Morning arrived soft and golden, sunlight filtering through the curtains and painting the room in warm amber tones. I woke to find Vittorio already awake, watching me with an expression that mixed tenderness with something more intense that made my heart skip. "Good morning," I murmured, suddenly conscious of everything that had happened during the night, and feeling a shyness I hadn't felt in the comforting darkness of earlier hours. "Good morning, amore mio," he replied, leaning in to kiss my forehead. "How are you feeling?" "Happy," I replied honestly. "A little sore, but incredibly happy." He frowned slightly with concern. "Did I hurt you?" "No," I assured him quickly, touching his face gently. "Just natural adjustments. Nothing that wasn't expected or that compares to how wonderful it was." We spent the morning slow and lazily, Vittorio insisting on preparing breakfast while I took a long shower that helped with the new sensitivity. When I emerged wrapped in his soft robe that was too big and smelled of cedar, and something indefinably Vittorio, I found him in the kitchen preparing pancakes and fresh fruit. "Any regrets?" he asked as we ate on the balcony overlooking the city that sparkled under the morning sun. "Only that we waited so long," I replied with a smile that made his eyes shine. "It was worth the wait," he said with conviction. "You were worth every second of patience, every moment of restraint, worth absolutely everything." It was then that we heard the sound of the elevator arriving, doors opening directly into the apartment in a way that suggested access that shouldn't exist, without specific permission. Vittorio tensed immediately, his posture changing from relaxed to alert in a fraction of a second as he stood from his chair. A woman entered the room with familiarity that spoke of shared history, tall and sophisticated in a dress that probably cost more than my 3-month salary. Her dark eyes swept the apartment before landing on me, and I saw recognition followed by something that looked unpleasantly close to disdain. "Vittorio," she said, in a voice that carried a more pronounced Italian accent than his, "we need to talk. It's important." Chapter 8.
Choose me tonight.
The tension in the apartment changed instantly with that woman's entrance, the air becoming heavy in a way that made my stomach tighten with instinctive anxiety. She was the type of woman I would never be, all polished sophistication and confidence that came from years navigating worlds I didn't even know existed. The dress she wore probably had an Italian label with a designer name I wouldn't recognize, and the way she moved through the space, spoke of intimate familiarity with every inch of that apartment. Vittorio had subtly positioned himself between me and the newcomer, his posture rigid in a way I'd never seen before. "Rachel," he said, and there was absolute ice in his voice that sent a shiver down my spine. "I don't recall giving you permission to enter my apartment. I still have the elevator code," she replied with a casual shrug that didn't match the intensity of her gaze when she studied me openly. "And when I saw you weren't answering calls, I thought it was important to check personally that everything was okay." "As you can see, I'm perfectly fine," Vittorio replied with controlled coldness. "And busy. So if there's no real emergency, you can leave now." Rachel laughed, but it was a sound without genuine humor. "Busy with her?" she asked, gesturing in my direction with a dismissive movement that made anger begin to simmer low in my stomach. "She's nobody, Vittorio. An ordinary librarian who probably can't even tell the difference between Armani and something bought at a department store." I stood up from my chair then, refusing to remain seated while being insulted in an apartment where I'd spent the most significant night of my life. Vittorio's robe was too big, and probably looked ridiculous on me compared to her elegance, but I kept my head high and met her gaze directly. "I may not know about fashion designers," I said calmly, "but I can read medieval Latin and distinguish fake manuscripts from authentic ones. Each person has their own types of knowledge." Something flashed in Rachel's eyes, perhaps surprised that I'd responded instead of shrinking. But before she could reply, Vittorio took a decisive step between us, effectively completely blocking her line of sight with me. "You're going to stop talking now," he ordered, with a voice that carried absolute authority he'd never used with me, but clearly used regularly in other areas of his life. "You're going to stop looking at her, you're going to stop breathing the same air as her, and you're going to leave my apartment immediately." "Vittorio, be reasonable," Rachel began, but he cut her off with an abrupt hand gesture. "There's nothing to be reasonable about here. You're invading my privacy, insulting the woman I love, and testing my patience in ways that will have consequences if you don't leave now." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had lowered to a dangerously soft tone. "Are you going to get tired of the innocent pose soon? That's not you. You need a woman who understands your world." I realized he was repeating her words back to her, and I saw Rachel go slightly pale as she recognized he'd anticipated exactly what she planned to say. "It's not a pose," Vittorio continued with absolute conviction. "She's the most real thing I've ever known in my entire life. And she's mine, completely and permanently. There's no room for you or anyone else who was part of my past." "You're making a mistake," Rachel tried one last time, but her voice had lost that initial confidence. "When the others find out about your weakness, when they realize you've attached yourself to someone so vulnerable and unprotected—" "Leave," Vittorio interrupted, and there was absolute finality in those two words. "Now, and don't come back. Ever. I'm changing the elevator codes within an hour, and if you try to enter here again, the consequences will be much worse than simply being sent away." I watched Rachel hesitate for a moment, clearly evaluating whether she should try to argue more, before finally turning and walking toward the elevator with steps that tried to maintain dignity but revealed defeat. The doors closed behind her with a final sound, and only then did Vittorio turn to me with an expression that mixed residual anger with genuine concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, quickly crossing the space between us and framing my face with his hands. "Did she hurt you? Did she say something that—" "I'm fine," I assured him, though my heart was still beating rapidly with adrenaline from the confrontation. "But Vittorio, what did she mean about them finding out about your weakness? About me being vulnerable and unprotected?" He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again there was something dark and heavy in their depths. "I need to tell you some things," he said quietly. "Things I've been putting off because I wanted to protect you for as long as possible, but that you deserve to know now that you're completely in my life." My stomach tightened with apprehension, but I nodded firmly. "Then tell me everything." We spent the next hour sitting in the living room, while Vittorio told me about the world he'd kept carefully separate from our afternoons at the library and romantic dinners. The D'Amico family didn't just run legitimate import and export businesses, as he'd vaguely suggested. They controlled territory in New York through methods that involved violence, intimidation, and absolute power, maintained through forced respect and calculated fear. "I'm not just a businessman," he confessed, watching my face carefully for signs of revulsion or fear. "I'm the head of the family. I make decisions that affect hundreds of people, resolve conflicts through means you probably don't want to know in detail, and do things that keep me awake at night, because I know there's no moral excuse that completely justifies them." I processed that information in silence, connecting all the signs I'd ignored or rationalized over the weeks. The discreet bodyguards, the constantly changing cars, the urgent calls in tense Italian, the way people reacted to him with a mixture of respect and poorly disguised fear. It all made sense now in ways I should have noticed before, if I hadn't been so focused on convincing myself it was just a normal relationship. And now that people know about me, I said slowly, know that you care about someone, that makes me a target. Yes, he confirmed miserably. Rival families will see you as weakness, as a way to pressure or hurt me, and I can't bear the idea of something happening to you because of me, of the choices I made, of the world I was born into. I should have been terrified. Any rational person would have run in the opposite direction upon discovering the man they'd fallen in love with was literally the head of the Italian Mafia in New York. But when I looked at Vittorio, all I saw was the same man who'd spent weeks courting me with infinite patience, who'd held my hand through emotional storms, who'd made the previous night something precious instead of just transactional. Then we face it together, I declared with firmness that surprised us both. I'm not running from love because it's complicated or dangerous. You didn't run from me when you found out I knew nothing about relationships or intimacy. Why would I run from you now? Matha, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, I interrupted, taking his hands in mine. I understand that you're more than just the things you do to support your family and protect your territory. I understand that the man who loves me is real, even though he's also someone dangerous in contexts I don't see. And I understand that choosing to be with you means accepting all of this, not just the easy romantic parts. He pulled me into an embrace so tight, it almost took my breath away, his face buried in my hair, as he held on as if afraid I might disappear if he let go. I'm not afraid, I whispered against his chest, feeling the accelerated beating of his heart. Or rather, I am afraid, but that doesn't change anything. I'm afraid, he admitted with raw vulnerability he rarely showed. Afraid for you, of losing you, that my life will destroy yours before we have a chance to build something lasting together. In the days that followed, my life changed in ways I was still processing. Vittorio insisted on security arrangements that initially seemed excessive, but that I gradually accepted as necessary. There were always discreet bodyguards accompanying me to and from the library. His apartment became my temporary residence because it was infinitely safer than my small place in Brooklyn. And Rafael Costa, Vittorio's right-hand man, became a constant presence informing me about security protocols and what to do in various emergency situations. Sophia was absolutely horrified and fascinated in equal measures when I finally told her everything. You fell in love with the head of the Mafia, she said flatly during a particularly tense coffee break. Matha Bradford, the girl who spent 25 years reading about other people's lives, literally fell in love with the protagonist of a crime thriller. When you put it that way, it sounds absurd, I admitted with a laugh that came out a bit hysterical. But Sophia, I love him, completely, and he loves me back in ways that have fundamentally transformed who I am. Just promise you'll be careful, she asked seriously, holding my hands across the table. Promise that if things get too dangerous, you'll consider your safety before romantic love. I promised, though I wasn't sure I'd be able to keep it if it came to the point of having to choose between my safety and staying with Vittorio. But fortunately, that choice didn't come immediately. What came was gradual adaptation to living in two worlds simultaneously, that of the silent library full of ancient manuscripts during the day, and that of the luxurious apartment with security measures worthy of Fort Knox during the nights. The attack attempt happened on an ordinary Tuesday, 2 weeks after the confrontation with Rachel. I was leaving the library at the usual time, Sophia beside me talking about a new acquisition of medieval letters, when an unfamiliar black car accelerated in our direction. The bodyguard Vittorio had insisted follow me, discreetly reacted in a fraction of a second, pushing me behind the protection of a concrete pillar as the car passed with windows rolling down. There were no shots like in dramatic movies, just the car accelerating again and disappearing into traffic, while my heart beat so hard I thought I might faint. Sophia was pale and trembling, and the bodyguard was already on the phone speaking rapidly in Italian while checking if we were injured. That was a message, he explained afterward, his expression somber. They didn't really try to hurt you today. They just wanted you to know they can reach you whenever they want. Vittorio arrived in 15 minutes, and I'd never seen him like this before. There was absolute fury in every line of his body, a cold, calculated rage that was infinitely more terrifying than any emotional explosion could be. He checked me obsessively, his hands running over my arms and face as if he needed to physically confirm I was unharmed. They touched what's mine, he said, and his voice was so low and dangerous it sent shivers down my spine. They threatened you. This doesn't stay like this. It can't stay like this. Vittorio, I began, but he cut me off with a quick, intense kiss before turning to Raphael, who'd arrived right after him. Gather everyone, he ordered, in a tone that didn't allow questioning. This ends tonight. Permanently. They wanted war by threatening her. I'll give them exactly that. Chapter 9.
Forever starts now.
The week following that tense Tuesday was the longest of my life. Vittorio insisted I stay in the apartment under constant surveillance while he handled what he vaguely called a situation with rival families, in a way that made it clear I shouldn't ask questions about specific details. Raphael remained with me the entire time, professional but comforting in a surprising way, keeping me informed about what he could without violating Vittorio's trust. Sophia visited daily, bringing books from the library and stories about work that helped me maintain some sense of normalcy, while my world seemed to be spinning completely out of control. We spent hours talking about everything and nothing, and in one of the most honest moments we'd ever shared, she held my hand and said quietly, "You know you don't have to stay in this, right? No one would judge you for choosing safety instead of complicated love." "I know," I replied, looking through the floor-to-ceiling window at the city stretching in all directions. "But this isn't just complicated love, Sophia. It's the love of my life, and I'm not giving it up because the path is difficult. I spent 25 years choosing the easy path, hiding behind books and loneliness. This is my chance to really live." Vittorio returned Friday night, exhausted in a way that went beyond merely physical. There were shadows in his eyes that weren't there before, a weight on his shoulders that spoke of difficult decisions and permanent consequences. But when he saw me waiting, something in that burden seemed to lighten slightly, and he pulled me into an embrace that lasted long enough for his heart to gradually slow against mine. "It's over," he murmured against my hair, his hands stroking my back comfortingly, as if he needed to hold me to confirm I was safe and whole. "The threat has been completely eliminated. You're safe now, Tesoro. Completely safe." I didn't ask what completely eliminated meant in practical terms. There were things about his world that were better not to know in specific details, boundaries he carefully maintained between his professional life and our personal life. What mattered was that the constant tension that had hung over us since that Tuesday had finally dissipated, and we could return to building the relationship that had been so abruptly interrupted. The weeks that followed were about gradual integration of the two worlds I now inhabited. I returned to work at the library, but on reduced hours that allowed me to maintain my professional identity without completely sacrificing time with Vittorio. He never suggested I stop working, never implied my career was less important than being available to him, and that respect for my independence meant more than words could express. "I don't want to lose who I am," I confessed one night, while we had dinner in his apartment. Now our apartment, considering I'd officially moved my most important things, and Dante had established himself as absolute king of the space. "I don't want to become just the Mafia boss's girlfriend who left her entire life behind." "I don't want you to lose anything," Vittorio replied with absolute conviction, reaching across the table to hold my hand. "I want to add to your life, Tesoro, not replace parts of it. Your books, your work, your passion for medieval manuscripts. All of that makes you who you are, and I love exactly who you are." It was on a rainy Tuesday in December, almost 4 months after that first meeting at the library, that Vittorio asked me to accompany him on a trip he refused to specify, beyond saying he needed to show me something important. The driver took us through Manhattan while the rain beat softly against the windows, and my heart began to beat faster when I realized we were approaching the Morgan Library. "Why are we here?" I asked, confused, as he opened the door and offered his hand to help me out of the car. "You'll see," he replied with a mysterious smile that made curiosity bubble inside me. The library was officially closed to visitors at that hour, but the director was waiting for us at the entrance and let us in with a respectful nod that suggested Vittorio had made specific arrangements in advance. We followed the familiar corridor to the rare manuscripts wing, that sacred space where everything had begun months ago when a man in an impeccable suit had entered, asking to see documents about the Medici family. The lights were off except for candles carefully positioned in safe places, far from the precious manuscripts, creating a soft, romantic atmosphere that transformed the familiar space into something magical and suspended in time. Flowers were arranged on the tables where we'd had our first conversation. White lilies and peach roses he knew were my favorites. "Vittorio," I began, but the words died in my throat when he knelt there among the shelves where we'd discussed Dante and Renaissance humanism and all the things that had served as pretext for something much deeper. "Marry me, amore mio," he said, his voice loaded with raw emotion he rarely showed so openly. A velvet box appeared in his hand, revealing a ring that captured the candlelight and reflected it in dancing patterns. "Make this official. I want the world to know you're mine. I want to be yours officially before God and all the laws that govern human relationships." Tears were already streaming down my face as I nodded vigorously, unable to form words through the emotion tightening my throat. He slid the ring onto my finger with slightly trembling hands, and then stood up and pulled me into a kiss that tasted of promise and commitment, and a future built together. "Yes," I finally managed to whisper against his lips. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." Wedding planning revealed fundamental differences in our backgrounds, that were simultaneously challenging and funny. Vittorio's family expected an extravagant celebration with hundreds of guests, an imported Italian band, and a party that would last entire days. I wanted something intimate and meaningful, surrounded only by people who really mattered instead of crowds of strangers, important through political or social obligation. "We'll do it your way," Vittorio declared, after a particularly tense meeting with his nonna, who'd flown from Italy specifically to help with preparations. "Small, intimate, just people we love. The rest can complain all they want, but this day is ours." The ceremony took place in a small chapel in early March, when winter was finally yielding to spring and the first flowers were beginning to defy the residual cold. Sophia was my maid of honor, beautiful in a lavender dress we'd chosen together during a shopping afternoon that involved lots of champagne and laughter. Raphael was Vittorio's best man, serious but clearly moved by the occasion that marked a fundamental change in the man he served loyally. Vittorio's nonna cried through the entire ceremony. Happy tears she didn't try to hide as she watched her grandson marry the woman who she declared in rapid Italian had finally brought humanity back to his eyes. Library colleagues mixed with respectful members of the D'Amico family, two worlds colliding in surprisingly harmonious fashion to celebrate a union no one would have predicted, but that everyone recognized as absolutely right. When the priest asked if I accepted Vittorio D'Amico as my husband, my voice didn't tremble. "I do," I declared with clarity that echoed through the small chapel, and I saw raw emotion cross his face before he recomposed himself. "I do," he replied when his turn came. And then we were married. Husband and wife, officially united before witnesses who mattered. The honeymoon in Tuscany was everything I could have dreamed of, and more. Vittorio took me through golden grape fields under Italian sun that seemed brighter than any light in New York, introduced me to distant cousins who ran family vineyards with generational pride, and showed me the ancient stone house where he'd spent childhood summers before responsibilities called him permanently to the United States. Nonna welcomed us in her large, fragrant kitchen, as if I were a granddaughter she'd known for years, instead of newly acquired through recent marriage. "She's perfect for you, Vittorio," she declared, as she watched us sitting at the time-worn table, my hand intertwined with his in a way that had already become second nature. "She made you human again, brought your heart back from whatever dark place you'd hidden it." We spent 2 weeks in that pastoral paradise, walking through vineyards and visiting medieval villages that seemed to come directly from the manuscripts I'd studied for years. Vittorio showed me Italy through the eyes of someone who loved it deeply, but who'd had to leave it behind for obligations he hadn't chosen, but had accepted as inevitable. "Do you regret it?" I asked one night as we sat on Nonna's porch, watching the sun set over the rolling hills. "Being born into this life, carrying these responsibilities you never asked for." He was silent for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I used to regret it," he finally admitted. "I used to look at paths I could have taken if I'd been born into a different family, if I'd had real choices about who to become. But then I met you, and suddenly everything I went through, every difficult decision and every dark moment was worth it, because it brought me to that afternoon at the library when I walked in looking for a pretext to come back the next day. We returned to New York renewed and ready to build a life together that balanced both worlds we inhabited." Vittorio made gradual changes in how he ran the family business, my influence softening approaches that before would have been resolved with immediate violence. It wasn't that he'd become soft or weak, but he'd developed patience and willingness to consider alternative solutions that before wouldn't have been contemplated. "You're making me better," he said one night, after resolving a territorial dispute through negotiation instead of direct confrontation, making me question methods I always accepted as the only way to do things. "You were already good," I corrected gently. "You were just hiding that goodness behind walls you built to survive in a difficult world. All I did was remind you that those walls don't need to be up 24 hours a day." 18 months after the wedding, I found myself sitting in a doctor's office receiving news that would change everything again. Vittorio was holding my hand hard enough to almost hurt, as the doctor confirmed what home tests had already suggested. "Congratulations," the doctor said with a warm smile. "You're going to have a baby." The expression on Vittorio's face as he processed that information was something I'll keep forever. Absolute wonder mixed with fear and joy, and a tenderness so deep it brought tears to my own eyes. His hands moved instinctively to my still flat belly, as if he could feel through touch the tiny life beginning to grow there. "A baby," he murmured in amazement. "Our baby." The months that followed were about preparation and anticipation, transforming one of the apartment bedrooms into a nursery that balanced elegance with practical functionality. Nonna called weekly from Italy with unsolicited but loving advice, and Sophia organized a baby shower at the library that was simultaneously the sweetest and strangest thing I'd ever experienced. Vittorio became even more protective if that was possible, his concern manifesting in ways that were sometimes suffocating, but always coming from genuine love. He insisted on accompanying every medical appointment, read every book about pregnancy and parenting he could find, and talk to my growing belly in a mixture of English and Italian that made my heart melt completely. "Boy or girl?" I asked one night, as he rested his head gently against my belly, feeling the kicks that had recently started. "Doesn't matter one bit," he replied with absolute conviction. "As long as they're healthy and have your kindness and intelligence. And your strength," I added, running fingers through his hair. "They'll need that strength to navigate the two worlds they'll inherit." Our daughter was born on a clear September morning, screaming indignantly at being forced to leave the comfort of the womb to face the cold reality of the outside world. Vittorio cried when he held her for the first time, tears streaming freely down his face as he observed that tiny, perfect face that already carried traces of us both. "She's perfect," he whispered with reverent wonder. "Absolutely perfect." "Elena," I suggested, testing the Italian name we'd discussed for months. "Elena Bradford D'Amico." "Perfect," he agreed, kissing our daughter's forehead with infinite tenderness before kissing mine. "Everything is absolutely perfect." Elena was 6 months old when I finally took her to the Morgan Library, wanting to show her the place where her story had really begun, long before she existed as a real possibility. Vittorio came with us, carrying the diaper bag with competence that would have been unthinkable years ago, when he was just a dangerous man in an expensive suit with no apparent capacity for tenderness. We walked together to the rare manuscripts wing, that sacred space that remained untouched by time while our lives had changed completely. Elena was awake and alert, her dark eyes so similar to her father's sweeping the environment with childlike curiosity. "It was here," Vittorio said softly, stopping at the exact place where we'd first met. "It was here that Daddy came in pretending to be interested in manuscripts about the Medicis, when he really just wanted a pretext to come back and see Mommy again. And it was here," I continued, taking Elena from his arms and holding her close, "that Mommy realized there was more to the world than just books and safe loneliness. It was here that everything changed." Hi, this is Lena, and you know that some stories don't end when the video does. If you want to keep the story going with him, his private line is open right now in the pinned comment. But let's be real, a man with his power is extremely busy, and everyone is fighting for his attention. Click the link and send your first message. If the line isn't full yet, you might be lucky enough to get a reply from him right now.